When a dusty-clothed plumber walked into Ridgemont Federal Bank clutching $8 million in inheritance papers, the arrogant manager took one look at his worn work boots and laughed him straight out the door. But what that banker didn't know was that the regional CEO was watching through the security cameras, and she was about to walk through those doors in 60 seconds. What happened next exposed years of corruption, destroyed a career built on cruelty, and brought together two broken souls who thought they'd never feel whole again. Stay with me until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The fluorescent lights inside Ridgemont Federal Bank hummed with that particular frequency that made Mason Reed's headache worse. He'd been awake since 4:30 that morning, already finished one emergency pipe job before the sun came up, and his back was reminding him that 32 wasn't as forgiving as 22 used to be. "Daddy, my feet hurt." Mason looked down at Sophie, whose small hand was wrapped around three of his fingers. She couldn't quite manage his whole hand yet. Her sneakers were getting too small again. He'd noticed her walking funny last week, but kept forgetting to buy new ones between jobs and bedtime routines and the general chaos of single fatherhood. "I know, sweetheart. Just a little longer, okay? Then we'll get pancakes. With chocolate chips? Don't push your luck." Sophie grinned up at him, and Mason felt that familiar twist in his chest, the one that came whenever she smiled exactly like her mother used to. 3 years hadn't made that any easier. The bank was nearly empty at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning. An elderly woman stood at the teller counter, counting out exact change with shaking hands while the teller waited with barely concealed impatience. A businessman in an expensive suit was arguing with someone on his phone about quarterly projections, his voice echoing off the marble floors. And behind the desk labeled branch manager, a man with perfectly styled silver hair and a tie that probably cost more than Mason's monthly grocery budget was watching them with the kind of expression you'd give a stray dog that wandered into a country club. Mason shifted the leather portfolio under his arm, the one his grandfather's estate lawyer had given him 2 weeks ago, and approached the reception desk. "Help you?" The receptionist didn't look up from her computer screen. "I need to speak with someone about a large deposit, an inheritance transfer." That got her attention. Her eyes flicked up, traveled across his oil-stained work jacket, the Carhartt pants with a rip at the knee, the boots that had seen better decades. Her expression shifted from bored to skeptical in under a second. "How large?" "8 million, give or take." The receptionist's laugh came out as a sharp bark before she could stop it. She tried to cover it with a cough, but Mason had already seen it. He'd been seeing variations of that laugh his whole life, from high school guidance counselors who suggested trade school instead of college, from his ex-wife's family who never thought a plumber was good enough for their daughter, from every person who'd ever judged the size of his bank account by the dirt under his fingernails. "Sir, if you're here to open a basic checking account, I can help you with that. But for anything else, I'm here to deposit $8.3 million from my grandfather's estate. I have all the documentation. I called ahead yesterday and spoke with someone named Patricia, who said to come in this morning." The receptionist's face went through several interesting colors. Let me get Mr. Whitmore." She disappeared into the back office, and Mason heard urgent whispering. Sophie tugged on his hand. "Daddy, that lady was mean." "She's just having a bad day, Soph." "You always say that, but I think some people are just mean." Mason couldn't exactly argue with that. Sophie had developed an unsettling ability to read people in the 3 years since her mother died. Child psychologists called it hypervigilance, a trauma response to loss. Mason called it heartbreaking. The man with the silver hair emerged from the back office, and Mason recognized the type immediately. Everything about Gerald Whitmore was calculated. The power tie, the Rolex that caught the light just right, the handshake that gripped too hard and lasted too long, the smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Reed, is it? I'm Gerald Whitmore, branch manager. I understand you're here about an inheritance?" "That's right. My grandfather passed 6 months ago. The estate just finished probate." Mason opened the portfolio and extracted the documentation: death certificate, probate court orders, account transfer authorizations, all signed and notarized and thoroughly legal. Whitmore took the papers with the tips of his fingers, like he was afraid the blue-collar germs might be contagious. His eyes scanned the first page, then stopped. Went back. Read it again. "This says $8.3 million. "Yes, sir." from an oil engineering estate. My grandfather worked in West Texas for 40 years, lived in a house that cost less than most people's cars, drove a truck until it literally died on the highway, and apparently invested every spare dollar he ever made. Mason kept his voice level, professional. He'd practiced this. The lawyer said he owned mineral rights, stock portfolios, bonds, some real estate. I didn't even know most of it existed until he died. Whitmore's expression had shifted into something Mason couldn't quite read. It wasn't disbelief anymore. The documentation was too official for that. It was something closer to resentment. Mr. Reed, you have to understand, we have protocols for this size of transfer, security concerns, money laundering regulations. We can't just deposit $8 million because someone walks in with paperwork. I called ahead. Your employee Patricia said everything was pre-approved for this morning. Patricia doesn't have the authority to approve transactions of this magnitude. Whitmore's smile had vanished entirely. I'm going to need to verify every document, run background checks, contact the estate attorney, and submit everything to our fraud prevention department. This could take several weeks. The probate judge already verified everything. It's all in the packet. Our protocols supersede probate court, Mr. Reed. That wasn't true, and they both knew it. Mason had spent enough time with the estate lawyer to understand exactly how inheritance transfers worked. This was just bureaucratic stonewalling dressed up in corporate language. How long? Mason asked quietly. Hard to say. 4 to 6 weeks minimum. Possibly longer if we find any irregularities. There won't be any irregularities. We'll see about that. Whitmore set the papers down on his desk without offering to make copies or start any actual processing. I'll have Patricia call you when we've completed our investigation. Sophie had been quietly drawing on a piece of scrap paper the receptionist had given her, but now she looked up at her father with those big dark eyes that missed nothing. Daddy, are we leaving? In a minute, baby. Mason turned back to Whitmore, keeping his voice level even as his jaw clenched. Sir, with all due respect, I've provided every document your bank requires. The estate attorney specifically chose this bank because of your reputation for handling large estate transfers. If there's a legitimate problem with the paperwork, I'm happy to address it. But if this is just what, Mr. Reed? Whitmore's voice had gone cold. Just me doing my job? Just me protecting this institution from potential fraud? Or are you suggesting something else? The air in the bank suddenly felt thick. The elderly woman at the teller window had stopped counting her change. The businessman had paused his phone call. Even the receptionist had frozen at her desk, pretending not to listen while obviously listening to every word. Mason felt Sophie's hand tighten around his fingers. She was 6 years old, but she understood tension the way other kids understood cartoons. He could feel her anxiety radiating up through that small hand, and he hated, absolutely hated, that she had to witness this. I'm not suggesting anything, Mason said finally. I just want to complete a legal transaction. And I want to make sure that transaction is legitimate. We'll be in touch, Mr. Reed. Patricia will validate your parking on the way out. It was a dismissal. A clean, corporate, completely legal dismissal that left Mason with no recourse except to leave or cause a scene, and he wasn't going to cause a scene in front of his daughter. Come on, Sophie, let's go get those pancakes. They were halfway to the door when Whitmore's voice carried across the lobby. Not quite loud enough to be unprofessional, but loud enough to make sure everyone heard. Patricia, make sure you document this interaction thoroughly. We need a complete record when people make claims like that. Mason's hand was on the door handle when Sophie stopped walking. Daddy? Not now, Soph. But Daddy, that man is lying. Sophie, he's lying, I can tell. He's lying like that teacher who said she lost my homework, but she really just didn't want to grade it. His face does the same thing. Several heads turned. The businessman had lowered his phone. Even the tellers were watching now. Sophie, we're leaving. Mason's voice came out harder than he meant it to, and he saw Sophie's face crumple slightly. Great. Now he was the bad guy for not letting his 6-year-old call out a bank manager's bullshit. They pushed through the glass doors into the cold October morning, and Mason took a breath that was supposed to steady him but just made his chest hurt worse. The parking lot was mostly empty. His battered pickup truck looked particularly pathetic next to the Mercedes and BMWs in the executive spaces. Mason dug out his keys while Sophie climbed into her booster seat, still clutching her drawing. I'm sorry I made you mad, she said quietly. You didn't make me mad, sweetheart. I'm not mad at you. You seem mad. Mason closed his eyes and counted to 5. A trick the grief counselor had taught him back when Sophie was 3 and he was drowning. I'm frustrated, but not at you. Never at you. At the lying man? Yeah, at the lying man. Why did he lie? How did you explain classism to a 6-year-old? How did you tell your daughter that some people looked at work boots and assumed poverty, assumed ignorance, assumed unworthiness? How did you explain that her father had just been judged and found lacking based on nothing but appearance and prejudice? Sometimes people make assumptions, Mason said finally. Sometimes they see what they expect to see instead of what's really there. That's stupid. Yeah, baby, it really is. He started the truck. It coughed twice before turning over, because of course it did, and was about to back out when Sophie made a small sound. Daddy, look! A black Mercedes SUV had just pulled into the executive parking space closest to the entrance. The door opened and a woman stepped out. She was maybe 30, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that was clearly expensive but not flashy. Dark hair pulled back in a way that was professional without being severe. She moved with the kind of purposeful stride that came from being in charge and knowing it. But what caught Mason's attention wasn't her appearance. It was the way she paused at the bank entrance, pulled out her phone, and scrolled through something with an expression that shifted from neutral to deeply unhappy in the span of about 5 seconds. Then she lifted her head, and for just a moment her eyes met Mason's through the windshield of his truck. He had the strangest feeling that she'd been looking for him specifically, which was impossible. She'd just arrived. She couldn't possibly know who he was or what had just happened inside. The woman broke eye contact, straightened her shoulders in a gesture that looked almost like armor, and walked into the bank. Who's that? Sophie asked. I don't know, baby. She looks important. Yeah, she does. Mason put the truck in reverse, ready to leave this whole humiliating morning behind, when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Hello? Mr. Reed? A woman's voice, crisp and professional. This is Patricia from Ridgemont Federal Bank. I'm calling to inform you that our regional CEO just arrived for a surprise inspection. She's requested that you return to the bank immediately if you're still in the area. Mason's eyes went to the glass doors where the woman in the gray suit had just disappeared. Why? She didn't say, sir. She just asked me to call you before you left. Mason looked at Sophie, who was watching him with that too old, too aware expression she got sometimes. Okay, he heard himself say. We're still in the parking lot. We'll come back in. He hung up and sat there for a moment, trying to process what was happening. Are we getting pancakes? Sophie asked. In a minute. We need to go back inside first. To see the lying man? Maybe. I'm not sure. They walked back across the parking lot, and this time when Mason pushed through the glass doors, the atmosphere inside had completely changed. Whitmore was standing near the teller counter, his face about 2 shades paler than it had been 10 minutes ago. Patricia, the receptionist, looked like she was trying to disappear into her desk, and the woman from the Mercedes SUV was standing in the center of the lobby with Mason's portfolio in her hands, reading through the documentation with an expression that could have flash-frozen nitrogen. She looked up when Mason entered, and her eyes were the color of steel. Mr. Reed, I'm Victoria Hayes, Regional CEO for the Southeast Division. I apologize for calling you back, but I need to speak with you about your transaction. Mason's stomach dropped. Here it came. The official rejection, delivered by someone high enough up the chain that there'd be no arguing. I understand, he started, but Victoria held up one hand. Mr. Whitmore, my office. Now. It wasn't a request. Whitmore followed her into the back like a man walking to his execution, and the door clicked shut behind them. The lobby was completely silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to be humming quieter. Sophie tugged on Mason's hand. Daddy, I need to use the bathroom. Okay, sweetheart. It's right over there. Can you go by yourself? I'm 6, Daddy. I can use a bathroom. She said it with such offended dignity that Mason almost smiled. Okay, I'll wait right here. Sophie headed for the restroom, and Mason stood there in the middle of the lobby, very aware that every employee in the building was pretending not to stare at him. The businessman had given up all pretense of his phone call and was openly watching the closed office door. The elderly woman had finished her transaction but hadn't left. Even the tellers had stopped processing their work. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then the office door opened and Whitmore emerged looking like he'd aged 10 years. His tie was loosened, his perfect hair was mussed, and his expression was carefully, precisely blank, in a way that suggested a massive effort of will. He walked straight past Mason without making eye contact, grabbed his briefcase from behind the reception desk, and left the building. Just left. Victoria appeared in the doorway, and her expression had shifted into something more controlled but no less intense. "Mr. Reed, would you mind stepping into the office? I'd like to discuss your inheritance transfer. My daughter is welcome to join us. Patricia, could you please bring some paper and crayons to my office?" "Of course, Ms. Hayes." Sophie emerged from the bathroom just then, and Mason guided her toward the back office with a hand on her shoulder. He had no idea what was about to happen, but something told him everything had just fundamentally changed. The office was standard corporate: desk, chairs, filing cabinets, framed certificates on the wall declaring various banking achievements. Victoria gestured for Mason to sit, then crouched down to Sophie's eye level. "Hi there, I'm Victoria. What's your name?" "Sophie." His daughter studied the CEO with that unnervingly direct gaze. "You're not mean like the other man. Thank you. That's good to know." Victoria didn't talk down to her, didn't use that sing-song voice adults always used with kids. She just talked to Sophie like a small person who deserved respect. "Your dad and I need to talk about some boring grown-up stuff. Patricia's bringing you some things to draw with. Is that okay?" "Okay. But if you're mean to my daddy, I'm going to know." Victoria's lips twitched. "I'll keep that in mind." Patricia arrived with supplies, and Sophie settled into a corner chair with the kind of focus she only showed when she was drawing. Mason sat across from Victoria's desk, every muscle in his body tense. Victoria opened the portfolio and spread the documents across her desk in a way that suggested she'd reviewed thousands of similar transfers. "Your documentation is completely legitimate," she said without preamble. "Probate orders are valid. Transfer authorizations are properly executed, and the estate attorney is one of the most respected in West Texas. There is absolutely no reason this transaction should have been delayed." Mason waited for the other shoe to drop. "Mr. Whitmore has been suspended pending a full investigation," Victoria continued. "This isn't the first complaint we've received about his treatment of customers, but it is the most thoroughly documented. We have security footage of your entire interaction." "You were watching?" "I arrived during this middle of your conversation. I have access to all security feeds from my phone." She tapped the device on her desk. "When I saw how he was treating you, I pulled your file immediately. Everything checked out, so I called you back before you could leave." Mason tried to process that. "Why?" "Because Mr. Whitmore was wrong, and this bank was wrong, and you deserved better treatment than you received." Victoria's voice was carefully controlled, but Mason caught something underneath it. Anger, maybe, or shame. "I'm approving your transfer immediately. The full amount will be available in your account within 48 hours. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Mason sat back in his chair and felt something in his chest unclench for the first time in 2 weeks. Since the lawyer had first told him about the inheritance. Since he'd started imagining everything it could mean for Sophie's future. College funds, medical emergencies, a house with a yard, maybe even the breathing room to work less and be home more. "Thank you," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Don't thank me for doing what should have been done in the first place." Victoria started gathering the documents, then paused. "Mr. Reed, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why this bank? Your grandfather's estate attorney could have recommended any institution in the state. Why Ridgemont Federal?" Mason shrugged. "The lawyer said you had a good reputation for estate transfers, and you're local. I didn't want to drive 3 hours to Dallas every time I needed to access the account. So you chose us for convenience and reputation." "Yeah, that's pretty much it." Victoria's expression did something complicated. "And we repaid that trust by treating you like a criminal." "You didn't. Whitmore did. Whitmore represents this bank. His actions are our actions." She closed the portfolio and slid it across the desk. "I can't undo what happened this morning, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again, to you or anyone else." Sophie looked up from her drawing. "You should fire him. That's what Daddy does when people are bad at their jobs." "Sophie," Mason started, but Victoria actually smiled. "That's solid management advice. I'll take it under consideration." Sophie went back to her drawing, apparently satisfied. Victoria pulled up something on her computer, typed rapidly for a few minutes, then turned the screen toward Mason. This is your new account, $8.3 million transferred from the estate holdings. I've waived all transfer fees and set up a private banking relationship that will give you direct access to a financial advisor whenever you need one. Mason stared at the numbers on the screen. He'd seen the paperwork, heard the lawyer explain it, but somehow seeing it in an actual account with his name on it made it real in a way nothing else had. That's a lot of money. Yes, it is. I don't know what to do with that much money. Most people don't. That's what the financial advisor is for. Victoria pulled up another screen. But there's something else you should know about, something the estate lawyer might not have mentioned yet. What? Your grandfather established a separate trust fund specifically for Sophie. It was set up 20 years ago, long before she was born, designated for future direct descendants. It's been accruing interest since then. Mason's brain had stopped processing words somewhere around separate trust fund. How much? $1.4 million. Restricted access until Sophie turns 18, with provisions for educational expenses and medical emergencies before then. Victoria turned the screen back toward herself. Did you know about this? No, the lawyer never mentioned it. It was probably in a separate filing. Estate attorneys sometimes handle education trusts through different paperwork. She made a note on her computer. I'll have our trust department send you the full documentation. You'll need to designate yourself as the trustee. Mason looked over at Sophie, who was completely absorbed in her drawing, tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. His grandfather had never even met her. He'd died 6 months before she was born. But somehow he'd still protected her, still provided for her future, still loved her across the distance of death and time. Mr. Reed, are you all right? Mason realized his eyes were burning. Yeah, sorry, my grandfather was a hard man. Not mean, just hard. He didn't talk much, didn't show emotion. I never really knew what he thought of me. And now you know. Yeah, now I know. They sat in silence for a moment while Victoria finished processing whatever needed to be processed on her computer. Sophie hummed quietly to herself while she drew. Somewhere outside the office, the bank was returning to its normal rhythm. Customers arriving, transactions processing, the mundane machinery of financial life grinding forward. But in this small office, something had fundamentally shifted. Can I ask you something? Mason said finally. Victoria looked up. Of course. Why did you come here today? To this branch specifically? Her expression shifted into something more guarded. We've had multiple complaints about discrimination, treatment of elderly customers, working-class customers, minorities. Today was supposed to be a routine inspection. But you saw me on the security feed. Yes. And you called me back. Yes. Why? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and Mason got the sense she was deciding how much truth to offer. Because I've spent the last 5 years building a career in an industry that judges everyone by appearances and account balances, she said finally. I've sat in meetings where executives laughed about undesirable customers. I've seen good people treated like problems because they didn't fit someone's idea of what wealth looks like. And I'm tired of it. So this was personal. Everything is personal, Mr. Reed. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. She closed her laptop with a soft click. Your transfer is complete. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Mason stood, suddenly aware that this conversation was ending and he didn't quite want it to, which was stupid. Victoria Hayes was a CEO who'd just saved him from a humiliating bureaucratic nightmare. She wasn't his friend. She was just someone doing her job with actual competence and human decency. No, that's everything. Thank you again. Sophie, are you ready to go? Victoria asked. Sophie held up her drawing. I made this for you. It was a picture of 3 people, one tall with dark hair and a suit, one medium-sized with messy brown hair, and one small with pigtails. They were standing in front of a building with bank written above the door in crayon. That's beautiful, Victoria said, and her voice had gone soft in a way that suggested she meant it. Can I keep it? Yes. Because you were nice to my daddy. Well, thank you. I'll put it right here on my desk. And she did. Set it carefully next to her computer monitor, like it was something precious instead of a 6-year-old's crayon scribbling. They walked out of the office together, and Mason was intensely aware of every employee in the building watching them. Patricia offered a nervous smile. The tellers pretended to be busy, and through the window, Mason could see Whitmore's parking space sitting empty. "Mr. Reed," Victoria said as they reached the door, "if you have any problems with your account, any questions about the trust fund, anything at all, call me directly." She handed him a business card with her personal cell number written on the back. "I mean that." "I will, thank you." They pushed through the glass doors into the parking lot, and the cold October air felt clean after the recycled atmosphere of the bank. Sophie skipped toward the truck, apparently unbothered by the morning's drama. Mason started to follow, then looked back. Victoria was still standing in the doorway, watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read. He raised his hand in a small wave. She returned it. Then he climbed into his truck, buckled Sophie into her booster seat, and drove away from Ridgemont Federal Bank with $8 million in his account and absolutely no idea what came next. "Daddy?" "Yeah, Soph? I like Victoria." "Me too, baby." "Is she going to be our friend?" Mason glanced in the rearview mirror at his daughter's hopeful face. "I don't know. Maybe. I hope so. She seemed lonely." "What makes you say that?" Sophie shrugged, a gesture she'd picked up from him and now used constantly. "I don't know. She just did. Like she's important, but she doesn't have anyone to be important with." Mason didn't have an answer for that, so he just drove. They got their pancakes, with chocolate chips, because after the morning they'd had, Sophie deserved them. They went to the park and fed ducks stale bread that was probably bad for the ducks, but made Sophie laugh. They picked up groceries and stopped at the hardware store for supplies Mason needed for a job tomorrow. Normal life. Regular routine. The same existence he'd been living for 3 years, just with a significantly different bank balance. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Mason sat at the kitchen table and stared at Victoria's business card. "Personal cell number. Call me directly." He thought about her standing in that office, apologizing for things that weren't her fault. He thought about her crouching down to Sophie's level instead of towering over her. He thought about the way she'd carefully placed a child's drawing on her desk, like it mattered. He thought about his daughter saying she seemed lonely, with the casual certainty of someone who recognized loneliness because she'd lived with it her entire conscious life. Mason flipped the card between his fingers, then set it on the refrigerator under a magnet shaped like a wrench that Sophie had given him for Father's Day. Tomorrow he had 3 jobs scheduled. The day after, he needed to call the estate lawyer about the trust fund paperwork. Next week, Sophie had a dentist appointment. Life went on, same as it always had. Except now, for the first time in 3 years, something felt different. Not fixed, not healed, not complete. Just different. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. 3 days passed before Mason's phone rang with an unfamiliar number again. He was under a kitchen sink in Mrs. Patterson's house, fighting with a corroded pipe that should have been replaced during the Clinton administration, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. 2 minutes later, it buzzed again with a voicemail notification. "Hand me the wrench, would you?" he called up to Sophie, who was sitting on Mrs. Patterson's kitchen floor doing homework. "The big one or the little one?" "The one that looks like it could win a fight." Sophie giggled and passed him the pipe wrench. Mason wedged himself deeper under the sink, braced his shoulder against the cabinet frame, and pulled. The pipe gave with a shriek of protesting metal and a spray of rust-colored water that hit him square in the face. "Daddy said a bad word," Sophie announced cheerfully. "Sophie, don't—" "Mrs. Patterson, Daddy said the S word." Mrs. Patterson's face appeared above the sink edge, peering down at Mason with amusement. She was 83 and had known Mason since he was Sophie's age. "I've heard worse, honey. Your grandfather said that same word when he fixed this exact sink in 1987. Mason wiped water from his eyes and tried not to think about the fact that he was literally following in his grandfather's footsteps, fixing the same broken pipes in the same small town, wearing the same stained work clothes. The $8 million in his bank account suddenly felt like Monopoly money, colorful but meaningless. He finished the repair, collected his fee. Mrs. Patterson always paid in exact cash and homemade cookies, and loaded Sophie back into the truck. It was only when he was buckled in that he remembered to check his voicemail. "Mr. Reed, this is Victoria Hayes. I have some additional information about Sophie's trust fund that I'd like to discuss with you. Nothing urgent, but I think you'll want to hear it. Give me a call when you have a chance. Her voice sounded different on the phone, more formal, less like the woman who'd crouched down to talk to his daughter, and more like the CEO, who'd suspended a branch manager with 3 sentences. Mason stared at the phone for a long moment. "Who was that?" Sophie asked, cookie crumbs already decorating her shirt. "Remember Victoria from the bank? She called about some paperwork. Are you going to call her back?" "Eventually." "Daddy, that means no." "It means eventually. You always say eventually when you mean no, like when I ask if we can get a dog." Mason pulled out of Mrs. Patterson's driveway and headed toward home, very carefully not examining why he was reluctant to call Victoria Hayes back. It wasn't like she was going to deliver bad news. The trust fund was already established. The money was already there. This was probably just some administrative detail that needed his signature. Except he kept hearing Sophie's voice in his head. She seemed lonely, and he kept remembering the way Victoria had carefully placed that crayon drawing on her desk, like it was the first gift anyone had given her in a long time. "Fine," he muttered. "Fine what?" "Nothing, Soph, just talking to myself." He waited until after dinner, after Sophie's bath, after the bedtime routine of teeth brushing and story reading and checking under the bed for monsters. Then he sat on the front porch with a beer he wasn't really drinking and called Victoria Hayes. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Reed, thank you for calling back." "Mason's fine. Mr. Reed makes me sound like my grandfather." "All right, Mason." There was a pause and he heard papers rustling. "I wanted to discuss the trust fund in more detail. Are you somewhere we can talk?" "Front porch. Sophie's asleep." "Good. This might take a few minutes." More rustling, then Victoria's voice came back clearer. "The trust fund your grandfather established is more complex than I initially described. It's not just a lump sum for college. It's structured with multiple provisions for Sophie's welfare throughout her life." Mason set down his beer. "What kind of provisions?" "Educational expenses, obviously, but also medical care, housing assistance, business capital if she wants to start a company, even support for creative pursuits if she goes into arts or music. Your grandfather built in clauses for basically every major life expense she might encounter between now and age 35. He died before she was born. I know, which makes this even more remarkable. He was planning for descendants he'd never meet. Mason looked out at the dark street, at the houses that all looked the same, at the neighborhood where he'd grown up and where Sophie was growing up and where probably her kids would grow up if the pattern held. His grandfather had escaped this place, made something of himself in the oil fields of West Texas, and apparently spent his last decades making sure his family would never struggle the way he had. "There's something else," Victoria said. "The trust includes a provision for discretionary funds before Sophie turns 18, specifically for enrichment activities that expand life experience beyond local opportunities." That's a direct quote from the trust documents. "What does that mean?" "It means if you want to take Sophie to Europe, or enroll her in specialized programs, or expose her to opportunities that wouldn't normally be accessible, the trust will cover it. Your grandfather wanted to make sure she had chances he never did." Mason's throat felt tight. "How much?" "Up to $50,000 per year with quarterly distributions. It's separate from the main trust corpus." $50,000 for a kid who got excited about chocolate chip pancakes and thought the zoo was the pinnacle of entertainment. "I don't know what to do with that," Mason said honestly. "You don't have to decide right now. I just wanted you to know it exists." Victoria paused. "Actually, that's not entirely true. I wanted to know if you were okay." "Why wouldn't I be?" "Because you just inherited life-changing wealth, and in my experience, that's rarely as simple as people think it should be." Mason took a drink of his beer, which had gone warm. "You deal with a lot of inheritances?" "Enough to recognize the patterns. Most people think money solves problems. It doesn't. It just changes which problems you have." "That sounds pretty cynical for a bank CEO. It sounds realistic for someone who's watched too many families destroy themselves fighting over estates." Victoria's voice had gone quieter. "I wanted to make sure you weren't struggling with this alone." "I'm not struggling, I'm just processing." "Good. That's healthy." A pause. "Can I ask what you're planning to do with the inheritance? You don't have to tell me. I'm just curious." Mason hadn't told anyone his plans yet, hadn't even fully articulated them to himself. But sitting on his dark porch talking to someone who seemed to actually want to know, the words came easier than expected. "I want to set up a fund," he said, "for single parents in the county who are struggling. Help with emergency repairs, utility bills, car payments, the kind of stuff that destroys you when you're already barely hanging on. When my wife died, we had medical debt and funeral costs, and I was trying to keep working enough to pay bills while taking care of a 3-year-old who'd just lost her mother. The church helped some. Friends helped some. But mostly I just drowned for about a year." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "That's a good use of the money." "Yeah, well, my grandfather spent 40 years living cheap, so he could help people he'd never meet. Seems like I should do the same. Most people would buy a new truck. My truck runs fine. It's held together with rust and prayers." Mason laughed despite himself. "You noticed that, huh?" "Hard to miss. It was making concerning noises even in the parking lot. That's just Rex expressing his feelings." "You named your truck Rex?" "Sophie named the truck Rex. I wanted to call it piece of shit, but that seemed inappropriate for a 6-year-old's vocabulary." Victoria's laugh came through the phone, genuine and surprised. "Fair enough." They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. The logistics of setting up a charitable fund, the upcoming winter weather, Sophie's apparent talent for reading people. It was easy in a way Mason hadn't expected, talking to someone who didn't need anything from him and wasn't trying to fix him. "I should let you go," Victoria said finally. "I'm sure you have an early morning." "Job at 6:30, burst pipe at the elementary school." "Glamorous." "Living the dream." Mason hesitated. "Hey, Victoria?" "Yes?" "Thank you for calling about the trust fund and for everything else." "You're welcome, Mason." He hung up and sat there for a while longer, watching the moths circle his porch light and thinking about parallel lives. In one version, he was a plumber in Ridgemont having a beer on his front porch. In another version, the one that almost happened, he was still drowning in grief and debt, working himself to exhaustion just to keep Sophie fed and sheltered. The inheritance hadn't changed who he was, but it had changed what was possible. He went inside and checked on Sophie, who was sprawled across her bed with her stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand and her other arm flung over her head like she'd passed out mid-declaration. Mason pulled her blanket up and kissed her forehead. "Love you, troublemaker," he whispered. She mumbled something incoherent and rolled over. Mason went to his own room, set his alarm for 5:30, and tried not to think about Victoria Hayes sitting in whatever kind of place a regional CEO lived in, talking to him instead of doing whatever successful people did with their evenings. The next morning, he was elbow deep in the elementary school's heating system when his phone rang again. Different number this time, the main bank line. "This is Mason." "Mr. Reed, this is Patricia from Ridgemont Federal. Ms. Hayes asked me to schedule a meeting with you about the trust fund paperwork. Would you have time this week?" Mason wedged his phone between his shoulder and ear while trying to tighten a connection that kept slipping. "Can't we just do it over the phone?" She specifically requested an in-person meeting, something about complex documentation that needs your signature. "Fine. When? Would Thursday at 2 work? I know that's short notice. Thursday's fine. I'll be there." He hung up and went back to work, trying to ignore the small voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like Sophie asking why he seemed nervous about a simple paperwork meeting. Thursday arrived cold and drizzling. Mason dropped Sophie at school, finished a morning job, and showed up at the bank at exactly 2 o'clock wearing his cleanest work shirt and jeans that didn't have any visible stains. Patricia looked up when he entered and smiled. "Mr. Reed, Miss Hayes is expecting you. Conference room B." The conference room was nicer than Whitmore's old office. Bigger windows, better furniture, and no sense of territorial posturing in the layout. Victoria was already there, spreading documents across the table with the focused efficiency of someone who lived in meetings. She looked up when Mason entered, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but warmer than professional neutrality. "Mason, thank you for coming in. You made it sound important." "It is. Sit down. Can Patricia get you coffee? Water?" "I'm fine." Victoria waited until the door closed, then pushed a stack of papers toward him. "These are the trust documents. They need your signature as trustee, plus several disclosure forms about how the funds can be accessed." Mason picked up the first document and immediately felt his eyes glaze over. Legal language had that effect on him. Too many whereases and hereafters and parties of the first part. "Just show me where to sign," he said. "No. Mason looked up, surprised. Victoria pulled the documents back toward herself. You don't sign anything you haven't read. That's rule one of having money. I trust you. That's nice, but irrelevant. You're about to become trustee of a $1.4 million fund for your daughter. You need to understand every clause, every restriction, every provision. So we're going to go through this page by page, and you're going to ask questions about anything you don't understand. That's going to take all day. I don't know half these words. Then I'll explain them. That's literally why I'm here. They spent the next hour going through the documents line by line. Victoria explained terms like corpus and discretionary distribution and fiduciary duty in language that actually made sense. She pointed out clauses that protected Sophie's interests, restrictions that prevented the money from being accessed inappropriately, and provisions that gave Mason flexibility to use the funds for her genuine benefit. This part here, Victoria tapped a section near the end. This is important. It says if you remarry and subsequently divorce, your ex-spouse has no claim on Sophie's trust. The money is protected specifically for her. Mason hadn't even thought that far ahead. Remarriage seemed like something that happened to other people, people whose first marriages hadn't ended in tragedy. I'm not getting remarried, he said. You might, someday. I'm 32 with a 6-year-old and a job that pays $35,000 a year. I'm not exactly a catch. Victoria gave him a look that was hard to interpret. You're a dedicated father who inherited $8 million and immediately started planning how to help other people. I think you're underestimating your appeal. Mason felt his face heat. Yeah, well, dating's not really on my radar. That's probably smart. Focus on Sophie. The rest will happen when it happens. Victoria turned to the next page. Now, this section covers educational expenses. It's broadly defined, which is good. Includes private school if you decide that's right for her, tutoring, extracurriculars, even educational travel. They kept working through the documents, and somewhere around page 15, Mason realized Victoria was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? He asked. Nothing. Most people get impatient with this process. They want to sign and leave. Most people probably understand legal documents better than I do. That's not it. Most people just don't care enough to invest the time. Victoria closed the folder she'd been reading from. You're a good father, Mason. I'm the only parent Sophie has. I don't get to be anything less than good. That's not how it works for everyone, trust me. There was something in her voice that made Mason look up. Victoria was staring at the documents with an expression that suggested she was seeing something other than legal text. Your parents? He asked quietly. Victoria blinked, and the moment passed. That's not relevant. You brought it up. I didn't bring anything up. You kind of did. They looked at each other across the conference table, and Mason had the distinct sense they were both deciding whether to acknowledge what had just almost been said. Victoria broke first. My father was a CEO. My mother was a lawyer. They were very successful, very busy, and very absent. I was raised by nannies and boarding schools and summer camps. They provided everything except presents. I'm sorry. Don't be. It made me independent. But the way she said it suggested independence wasn't something she'd necessarily wanted. Is that why you became a CEO? Following in your father's footsteps? Following in his footsteps would imply I was trying to gain his approval. I'm not. I haven't spoken to either of them in 3 years. Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he just waited. Victoria closed the last folder with more force than necessary. I built my career to prove I didn't need them. And I succeeded. I have the title, the salary, the corner office. Everything they said I wouldn't achieve because I was too soft, too emotional, too female. She looked up. And you know what? It's exactly as empty as they made their own lives. So why keep doing it? Because I don't know how to do anything else. Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. I'm 30 years old. I've been working 80-hour weeks since I graduated college. I have no hobbies, no close friends, no life outside this job. And I recently realized that if I died tomorrow, my obituary would read like a resume. Nothing in it would suggest I was actually human. Mason thought about his own life. The early mornings and late nights, the constant worry about Sophie, the loneliness that had become so familiar he sometimes forgot it was there. He thought about coming home to an empty house after Sophie was in bed, eating microwaved leftovers standing over the sink, lying awake wondering if he was doing any of this right. I get that, he said quietly. Victoria turned from the window. Do you? My wife died 3 years ago. Since then, it's been me and Sophie against the world. I work, I parent, I sleep when I can. I have exactly one friend, a guy I went to high school with who checks in on me every few months to make sure I haven't completely fallen apart. My romantic life is non-existent. My social life is PTA meetings and parent-teacher conferences, and most days I'm too tired to care. But you have Sophie. Yeah, I have Sophie. Mason smiled despite himself. Which makes all the difference, actually. Because even on the worst days when I'm exhausted and stressed and wondering what the hell I'm doing, she's there. She needs me. She loves me. She makes everything mean something. Victoria's expression had gone soft. You're lucky. I know. No, I mean it. You have purpose. You have someone who needs you to be present, not just successful. That's rare. You could have that too. Could I? Victoria laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I'm 30 years old with a career that requires constant travel and 80-hour work weeks. I've been on exactly 3 dates in the last 2 years, and all 3 ended when the guy realized I made more money than him and had less free time than a medical resident. I'm not exactly positioned for domestic bliss. So change positions. It's not that simple. Why not? Victoria opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Because I've spent 10 years building this career. Because I've proven everyone wrong who said I couldn't do it. Because if I step back now, all those people who doubted me get to be right. Or, Mason said slowly, all those people who doubted you don't matter, and you get to build a life that actually makes you happy. They stared at each other across the conference room, and Mason realized he'd just told a woman he barely knew to quit her job and rethink her entire life, which was wildly inappropriate and absolutely none of his business. Sorry, he said. That was out of line. No. Victoria's voice was quiet. No, it wasn't. She came back to the table and sat down, but didn't pick up any of the documents. Just sat there looking at Mason like he'd said something in a language she was still trying to translate. Can I ask you something personal? She said finally. Sure. Do you ever regret it? Staying in Ridgemont, working as a plumber, living the life you're living instead of something else? Mason considered that. Sometimes. When I'm up at midnight with a sick kid and a job at 6 a.m. When I'm fixing the same leak for the same customer for the 3rd time because they won't pay for a real repair. When I realize my entire social circle is people I went to high school with and we're all just slowly turning into our parents. But then Sophie does something that makes me laugh, or I fix a problem that actually helps someone, or I sit on my porch and drink a beer and think about how I get to wake up in the same house as my kid every single morning. And I realize I don't want something else. I want this. Just maybe with slightly better plumbing and more sleep. Victoria smiled, a real one this time. That's a good answer. It's an honest answer. Those aren't always the same thing. They finished the paperwork in companionable silence, Victoria explaining clauses and Mason signing where indicated. When they were done, Victoria gathered everything into a folder and handed it to him. You're all set. The trust is officially active, and you have full access to the discretionary funds. Any questions? Just one. Shoot. Why are you being so nice to me? Victoria blinked. What? You're a regional CEO. You suspended your branch manager and personally handled my account and spent 2 hours walking me through trust documents that you could have explained in an email. Why? She was quiet for a long moment, and Mason watched her face cycle through several expressions before landing on something that looked like resignation. Honestly, I don't know. You walked into that bank 3 days ago and I saw Whitmore treating you like garbage and something about it just, I couldn't let it stand. And then I talked to you and Sophie and I realized you were exactly the kind of person this industry is supposed to serve, but usually dismisses. And then I kept finding excuses to stay involved because... She trailed off. Because talking to you reminds me that there are people in the world who care about things that actually matter, and I don't get that very often in my job. Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. They walked out of the conference room together, and Mason was very aware of Patricia watching them with barely concealed interest. The other employees were trying to look busy, while obviously tracking Victoria's movements across the lobby. "Do they always watch you like that?" Mason asked quietly. "I'm the boss. They're paid to watch me like that." Seems exhausting. It is. They reached the door and Mason realized he didn't want to leave, which was stupid. Victoria had work to do and he had a 3 o'clock job fixing a water heater in someone's basement. This was just a business meeting that had run slightly long, except it hadn't felt like business. "Mason," Victoria said, and her voice had gone careful, "would you want to have coffee sometime, just to talk? Not about the trust fund or the bank, just talk." Mason's heart did something complicated in his chest. Like a date. Like two people getting to know each other without any professional obligations involved. "I have a 6-year-old. "I know. And a truck named Rex. "I'm aware. And I smell like pipe grease most of the time. "I'll survive." Mason looked at Victoria Hayes, successful, polished, completely out of his league in every measurable way, and saw something in her eyes that looked like hope mixed with fear. "Okay," he heard himself say. "Coffee sounds good." "Saturday, 10 a.m., there's a place downtown that makes terrible coffee but excellent pastries. Sophie will want to come." I assumed. I like Sophie. "She'll ask you a million questions." "I can handle it." They exchanged numbers, and Mason left the bank in a daze. He climbed into Rex, turned the key twice before the engine caught, and sat there processing what had just happened. Victoria Hayes had asked him on a date. Sort of. Maybe. He had no idea what he was doing. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For the record, that was definitely a date, just so we're clear. Victoria. Mason smiled and texted back. "Good to know. I haven't been on a date since 2019. "Me neither. We'll figure it out together." He drove to his 3 o'clock appointment feeling lighter than he had in months, and tried very hard not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of nervous energy Mason hadn't felt since high school. He changed shirts 3 times before Sophie noticed. "Daddy, why are you being weird?" "I'm not being weird." "You changed your shirt again. That's 4 times. "It's 3 times. 4. I counted." Sophie was sitting on his bed watching him with the amused tolerance of someone witnessing a minor breakdown. "Is this because of Victoria?" Mason froze with his hand on a 4th shirt. "Okay, fine, 4th shirt." "What makes you say that?" "Because you told me we're getting coffee with her, and you've been acting strange ever since. You even shaved last night. You never shave on Friday." "I shave plenty." "When Mrs. Chen makes you take a family photo for the church directory, that's once a year." Mason gave up and sat down on the bed next to his daughter. "Okay, yes. This is because of Victoria. I want to make a good impression." "Why?" "She already likes you." "How do you know that?" Sophie rolled her eyes with the exasperation only a 6-year-old could muster. "Because she asked us to get coffee." "Duh." "She might just be being nice." "Daddy, you're being dumb." "Sophie, you are. She drew with me and she put my picture on her desk, and she looks at you like Miss Rodriguez looks at Principal Martinez when she thinks nobody's watching." Mason blinked. "How do you even know about that?" "Everyone knows about that. They hold hands in the parking lot after school." Sophie stood up and patted his shoulder with grave seriousness. "Wear the blue one. It makes your eyes look less tired." So Mason wore the blue one and they drove to the coffee shop in Rex, who started on the first try for once. Small miracles. Victoria was already there when they arrived, sitting at a corner table by the window. She was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual suit, and Mason had the disorienting realization that she looked younger like this, less like a CEO and more like a person. She stood when she saw them, and her smile was nervous. Mason found that oddly reassuring. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Mason replied. They stared at each other for a beat too long before Sophie broke the silence. "Hi, Victoria. Daddy wore his good shirt because he wanted to impress you." "Sophie?" "What? You did?" Victoria laughed, and the tension broke. "Well, it worked. I'm very impressed." They ordered coffee, terrible, as advertised, and pastries that were spectacular enough to make up for it. Sophie immediately claimed a chocolate croissant the size of her head and settled into intense focus on the task of eating it without getting chocolate everywhere. She failed within 30 seconds. "So," Victoria said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup, "this is weird, right? I'm not imagining that this is weird. It's definitely weird, Mason agreed. I haven't been on a date that's maybe not quite a date since my early 20s. I haven't been on any kind of date since my wife was alive. They looked at each other, and Victoria's expression softened. I'm sorry, I should have asked. Is this too soon? I don't want to... It's not too soon. It's just different. Mason took a sip of coffee that tasted like burnt regret. Sarah died 3 years ago, and I loved her. Still love her, I guess. You don't stop loving someone just because they're gone. But I also know she wouldn't want me to be alone forever. She actually made me promise, right before the end, that I'd let myself be happy again someday. That's beautiful. It felt impossible at the time. Mason watched Sophie, who was now trying to lick chocolate off her own elbow. Some days it still does. But then I meet someone who asks me to coffee, and I think maybe Sarah was right. Victoria's eyes had gone bright. I'm glad you came. Me too. Sophie looked up, chocolate smeared across her face like war paint. Are you guys going to be gross and hold hands and stuff? Sophie, what? That's what people do on dates. Tommy's mom has a boyfriend and they're always holding hands. It's weird, but Tommy says you get used to it. Victoria was trying very hard not to laugh. We're just having coffee, Sophie. That's what they all say. Mason decided a subject change was necessary. So, Victoria, tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with banking. Victoria considered that, turning her coffee cup in slow circles. I don't know if I have anything. Everyone has something. No, I mean it. My entire adult life has been work. I can tell you about quarterly earnings and risk assessment protocols and federal banking regulations. But hobbies? Interests outside the office? I honestly don't know what those would be anymore. What about before? When you were a kid? I wanted to be a veterinarian. I was obsessed with animals. Had a whole collection of books about marine biology and wildlife conservation. Victoria smiled at the memory. My parents thought it was a phase. When I told them I wanted to study zoology in college, my father laughed and said I'd grow out of it once I understood how the real world worked. Did you? Grow out of it? No. I just buried it under business school and internships and climbing the corporate ladder. She took a sip of her terrible coffee. I can't remember the last time I even thought about that dream. Sophie had been listening with the intensity she usually reserved for cartoon plot twists. Do you still like animals? I do, actually. We're going to the zoo next weekend, Sophie announced. You should come with us. Mason felt his face heat. Soph, we can't just invite... Why not? You said we were going. She likes animals. It makes sense. Victoria was smiling now, really smiling. I would actually love that, if it's okay with your dad. It's okay with my dad, Sophie said with absolute certainty. Mason looked at his daughter, then at Victoria, then back at his daughter. Apparently it's okay with me. Excellent, Sophie said. Now, can I get another croissant? No. Half a croissant? You still have half of that one. This is the old half. I want a new half. That doesn't make any sense. You don't make any sense. Victoria laughed, and it was such a genuine sound that Mason found himself laughing too. They spent the next hour talking about nothing important. Sophie's school, Mason's worst plumbing disasters, Victoria's spectacularly failed attempt at learning to cook during the first pandemic lockdown. I set off the fire alarm making scrambled eggs, Victoria said. Scrambled eggs! The firefighters were very polite about it, but I saw them laughing when they left. How do you burn scrambled eggs? I have no idea. I followed the recipe exactly, but somehow they went from liquid to carbon without any middle stage. That's actually impressive. I ordered takeout for 6 months after that. Sophie was building a castle out of sugar packets, half listening to the adult conversation while narrating an elaborate story about a princess who lived in a castle made of sugar and had to defend it from ants. Mason watched her play and felt something in his chest unclench. This was normal. This was nice. This was the kind of thing he'd thought he'd never have again. Sitting in a coffee shop with someone who made him laugh, watching his daughter be a kid instead of the miniature adult she sometimes had to be. Can I ask you something? Victoria said quietly, pitched below Sophie's hearing. Sure. What happened with your wife? You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. I'd like to know. Mason took a breath. He told this story before, to therapists, to Sophie's counselor, to the grief group he'd attended for about 6 weeks before deciding he was too tired to keep going. but it never got easier. Car accident. Black ice on Highway 40, 3 days after Christmas. She was coming home from her parents' house with Sophie. A semi crossed the median and hit them head on. He kept his voice steady, clinical. Facts were easier than feelings. Sophie was in her car seat in the back. She walked away with a broken arm. Sarah died at the scene. Victoria's hand moved across the table and covered his. I'm so sorry. The worst part is how random it was. If they'd left 5 minutes later, if she'd taken a different route, if the semi-driver hadn't reached for his phone at that exact moment, any one of 1,000 tiny changes and she'd still be here. Mason looked down at Victoria's hand on his. I spent about a year playing that game. All the what-ifs and if-onlys. It nearly destroyed me. What changed? Sophie. She was 3 years old, and she'd lost her mother, and I was so deep in my own grief, I was barely functional. One night she crawled into my bed and said, Daddy, you're sad all the time now, and it makes my tummy hurt. And I realized I was failing her, so I got help. Therapy, medication for a while, lots of stumbling through the dark trying to figure out how to be both parents. And eventually I learned how to live with it, instead of drowning in it. Victoria's thumb moved across his knuckles. You're stronger than you think. I'm not strong. I just didn't have a choice. That's what strength is. Doing what needs to be done even when you don't think you can. They sat there for a moment, hands linked across the table, while Sophie narrated the sugar packet princess's victory over the ant army. Okay, Victoria said finally, your turn to ask me something hard. Why did you stop talking to your parents? She laughed, but it was dark. Right for the throat, huh? You don't have to answer. No, it's fair. Victoria pulled her hand back and wrapped it around her coffee cup again. They threw a party for my 30th birthday. Big event, important people, everyone from the company, and halfway through, I realized they'd invited every executive they wanted to impress, and exactly none of my friends. Because they didn't know who my friends were. Didn't even know if I had friends. They'd thrown a party for themselves and called it my birthday. That's awful. That was normal. Everything was always about appearances and advancement and doing whatever served their agenda. When I called them on it, my father said I was being ungrateful. My mother said I was too sensitive. And I realized that in 30 years, they'd never actually seen me as a person. Just an extension of themselves. A project to be managed. So you walked away. So I walked away. Haven't spoken to either of them since. Victoria's smile was brittle. They send flowers to my office on my birthday. Always the same arrangement from the same expensive florist. I give them to Patricia because I can't stand looking at them. Sophie chose that moment to look up from her sugar packet castle. My teacher says families are the people who love you, not just the people you're related to. Both adults turned to look at her. That's very wise, Sophie, Victoria said quietly. I know. I'm smart, said with absolutely zero humility. Can we go to the bookstore now? Daddy promised. I promised if you were good. I was good. I didn't interrupt except when it was important, and I only asked for one extra croissant. Mason looked at Victoria. Want to tag along? Fair warning, the children's section is chaos. I would love to. They walked to the bookstore 3 blocks away, Sophie skipping ahead and occasionally circling back to grab Mason's hand. The day was cold but sunny, and Ridgemont's downtown area was doing its weekend bustle. Families out shopping, couples browsing antique stores, a busker playing guitar on the corner with a dog sleeping in his open case. The bookstore was exactly as chaotic as promised. Sophie made a beeline for the children's section and started pulling books off the shelf with the systematic efficiency of someone on a mission. She reads at a 3rd grade level, Mason said, watching his daughter create a small mountain of picture books. Teacher says she's advanced for her age. Gets it from her dad? Gets it from her mom. Sarah was an English teacher. Read to Sophie every night from the day she was born. Mason picked up a book Sophie had discarded and put it back on the shelf. I try to keep that tradition going, but I'm not as good at it. I do all the voices wrong. I bet Sophie doesn't care. She corrects my pronunciation of quinoa every time. Victoria laughed and picked up one of Sophie's selections, a book about marine life with detailed illustrations of deep-sea creatures. This is cool. She's obsessed with octopuses right now. Octopi. I never know which is right. Either works, but octopuses is more common. Victoria flipped through the pages. Did you know they have 3 hearts? I did not know that. 2 pump blood to the gills, 1 pumps it to the rest of the body. And their blood is blue because it's copper-based instead of iron-based. Mason stared at her. How do you know that? Marine biology, remember? I might have buried the dream, but I kept the facts. Victoria looked almost embarrassed. I still read about it sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. Just pull up research papers and articles about ocean conservation and new species discoveries. It's the only thing I do that's just for me. That's not a small thing. It feels small when you stack it against everything else. The career, the travel, the constant performance of being successful. She set the book down carefully. Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if I'd actually pursued it. If I told my parents no and studied what I wanted instead of what they wanted. It's not too late. I'm 30 years old with a career I can't just walk away from. Why not? Victoria opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. That's the second time you've asked me that. Because I still haven't heard a good answer. Before Victoria could respond, Sophie appeared with an armload of books that collectively weighed more than she did. I'm ready. You can pick 3, Mason said. These are 3. Sophie, that's 8 books. 3 groups of books. For science, for bedtime, and for when I'm sad. That's not how counting works. They negotiated down to 4 books. Mason was a soft touch, and everyone knew it. While they waited in line to pay, Sophie leaned against Victoria's leg with the casual affection of someone who'd decided they were friends. Do you have kids? Sophie asked. No, I don't. Do you want kids? Sophie, Mason started, but Victoria waved him off. I never really thought about it, she said honestly. My job doesn't leave much room for a family. That's sad. Maybe, but it's the choice I made. Sophie considered this with the gravity of a tiny philosopher. Daddy says you can always make different choices, even when you think you can't. Victoria looked over Sophie's head at Mason, and her expression was complicated. Your dad is pretty smart. I know, Sophie said. He fixed the mayor's toilet once. The mayor said he was a genius. I said the pipe configuration was unnecessarily complex, Mason corrected. The mayor said genius. I said overcomplicated plumbing. They paid for the books and walked back out into the cold sunshine. Sophie immediately demanded to be carried. Selective exhaustion was her specialty, and Mason hoisted her onto his shoulders. I should probably get going, Victoria said when they reached her car. I have some work to catch up on. On Saturday? The job doesn't really respect weekends. Mason shifted Sophie's weight on his shoulders. You know the zoo is open Sunday too. If you wanted to come tomorrow instead of next weekend. Victoria's face lit up in a way that made her look about 10 years younger. Really? Really? Sophie's been talking about the new penguin exhibit for weeks. Fair warning, though, it's going to involve a lot of walking and probably overpriced gift shop purchases. I can handle that. And Sophie will ask you approximately 4,000 questions. I'm counting on it. They made plans to meet at the zoo at 10, and Victoria drove away in her Mercedes that didn't make any concerning noises. Mason watched her go while Sophie drummed her heels against his chest. I like her, Sophie announced. I got that impression. She's sad, though. What makes you say that? The same thing that makes you sad. She's lonely, and she thinks nobody notices. Sophie pulled on Mason's hair to steer him toward their truck. But we notice. Right, Daddy? Yeah, baby. We notice. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Mason's phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Thank you for today. I had more fun than I've had in months. Mason smiled and texted back. Same. See you tomorrow. Looking forward to it. Also, your daughter is kind of terrifying. In a good way. She gets that from her mother, too. Sarah sounds like she was amazing. Mason stared at that message for a long time before responding. She was. I think she would have liked you. That means a lot. More than you probably know. He set his phone down and looked at the photo on his bedside table. Sarah on their wedding day, laughing at something outside the frame. He'd talked to that photo a lot in the first year after she died. Asked her questions, apologized for things, begged her to tell him what to do. He didn't do that anymore. But tonight he looked at her smiling face and whispered, I think I'm ready. I hope that's okay. The photo didn't answer, but Mason didn't need it to. He turned out the light and went to sleep with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Sunday morning dawned gray and threatening rain, but Sophie was undeterred. She'd laid out her zoo outfit the night before, rainbow leggings, light-up sneakers, and a jacket covered in animal patches that Sarah had sewn on before she died. Victoria met them in the parking lot wearing jeans and a jacket that probably cost more than Mason's monthly mortgage, looking nervous and excited in equal measure. "Ready?" Mason asked. "Absolutely." The zoo was crowded with families taking advantage of the Sunday morning discount. They navigated through the entrance, and Sophie immediately grabbed a map, studying it with the intensity of a general planning an invasion. "Penguins first," she declared, "then elephants, then the gift shop." "We're not going to the gift shop first thing," Mason said. "I said last thing. Weren't you listening?" They followed Sophie's carefully planned route through the zoo, stopping at every exhibit to read the information plaques. Victoria knew random facts about almost every animal they saw, delivered with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she was genuinely excited to share them. "Elephants have specific calls for different types of threats," she explained at the elephant enclosure. "Different warnings for humans versus predators versus other elephants." "How do they learn that?" Sophie asked. "Older elephants teach the younger ones. They have a complex social structure and pass knowledge down through generations. Like how Daddy teaches me to fix sinks." "Exactly like that." At the penguin exhibit, Sophie pressed her face against the glass and watched the birds dive and swim with complete absorption. Victoria stood next to her, and Mason noticed she was just as mesmerized. "This was worth the price of admission," Victoria said quietly. "The penguins. All of it. I can't remember the last time I did something like this. Just existed, without an agenda or a meeting or a performance review looming. This is just a regular Sunday for us." "I know. That's what makes it special." They watched the penguins for another 10 minutes before Sophie declared she was hungry. The zoo's cafeteria offered exactly the kind of overpriced mediocre food Mason expected, but Sophie was delighted with her chicken nuggets shaped like animals. "I'm eating a zebra," she announced, holding up a nugget. "That's definitely a horse," Mason said. "It's a zebra. See the stripes? Those are grill marks." Sophie ate the zebra horse with defiant satisfaction. Victoria's phone buzzed repeatedly throughout lunch. She kept silencing it, but Mason noticed her jaw getting tighter with each notification. "You can take that if you need to," he said. "I don't need to. It's just work." "On Sunday?" "Work doesn't really stop." Victoria glanced at her phone screen and her expression darkened. "It's Whitmore's replacement. He wants to schedule a Monday morning meeting to discuss branch restructuring. Do you want to go?" "We can cut this short." "No." Victoria silenced her phone completely and put it face down on the table. "Whatever it is can wait. I'm exactly where I want to be." Sophie, who'd been focused on her nuggets, looked up. "You should quit." Both adults stared at her. "Sophie," Mason started. "What?" "She hates her job. She should quit." Sophie returned to her nuggets like she'd just commented on the weather. Victoria laughed, startled. "It's not that simple, Sophie." "Why not? If something makes you sad, you should stop doing it. That's what Daddy tells me when I don't want to play with mean kids at school." "Your job is a little different than playground politics." "Is it, though?" Sophie looked genuinely curious. "You said your job makes you lonely and stressed, and you work all the time and never get to see penguins. That sounds mean to me." Victoria looked at Mason helplessly. "Does she always do this? Cut through nonsense to get to uncomfortable truths?" "Yeah. It's a gift and a curse." "Mostly a gift," Sophie said. They finished lunch and continued through the zoo, Victoria's phone staying silent in her pocket. At the big cat exhibit, they watched a tiger pace the length of its enclosure in endless repetition. "I used to feel like that," Victoria said quietly. She was standing slightly apart from Mason and Sophie, arms wrapped around herself. "Like I was in this beautiful cage that everyone thought I should be grateful for. Good food, nice surroundings, everything I needed, but still just pacing, going nowhere." "Used to?" Mason asked. "I don't know. Maybe I still do." She turned to look at him. "Does that sound crazy?" "It sounds honest." "Daddy says being honest is the bravest thing you can do," Sophie contributed. She was sitting on Mason's shoulders now, sticky hands in his hair. Your daughter is wise beyond her years. She gets it from the internet and Daniel Tiger. They spent another hour wandering through exhibits, Sophie's energy somehow increasing as the afternoon wore on. By the time they reached the inevitable gift shop, Mason's back was aching and his wallet was crying. But Sophie was vibrating with pure joy. Can I get a stuffed penguin? She asked. A small one. A medium one? Small. A medium small one? Mason looked at Victoria, who was trying not to laugh. You're enjoying this. Immensely. I've never seen someone negotiate with such determination. She could run the UN. Sophie emerged victorious with a medium-sized penguin she immediately named Victoria, which made the actual Victoria's eyes get suspiciously bright. I'm honored, she said. He's going to live on my bed with Rabbit and Bear and the octopus that doesn't have a name yet because I haven't decided. That's a good spot. They walked back to the parking lot as the afternoon was fading into evening. Sophie was draped over Mason's shoulder like a sleepy barnacle, clutching her new penguin and humming tunelessly. Thank you for letting me crash your day, Victoria said when they reached her car. You didn't crash, you were invited. Mason adjusted Sophie's weight. Same time next weekend? Sophie wants to see the reptile house. I would love that. Victoria hesitated, then stepped forward and kissed Mason quickly on the cheek. I'll see you next Saturday. She drove away before Mason could respond, leaving him standing in the parking lot with a sleeping 6-year-old and the ghost of a kiss warming his face. Daddy? Sophie mumbled into his shoulder. Yeah, baby? I really like Victoria. Me too. Like? The way Tommy likes Melissa? Maybe. I don't know yet. I hope you figure it out. She makes you smile different. Different how? Like you're not pretending anymore. Mason carried his daughter to the truck and buckled her into her booster seat, her new penguin clutched tight in her sleep-slack hands. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, watching Victoria's taillights disappear around a corner. Sophie was right. He wasn't pretending anymore. And that was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The following week settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. Mason worked his regular jobs, picked Sophie up from school, made dinner that was never quite as good as he wanted it to be. But now his phone buzzed with texts from Victoria throughout the day. Photos of terrible coffee, complaints about meetings that could have been emails, questions about what 6-year-olds liked because she'd seen something at a store and thought of Sophie. On Wednesday afternoon, Mason was replacing a garbage disposal when his phone rang. Victoria's name on the screen. Hey, he answered, wedging the phone between his shoulder and ear. Give me 1 second. Take your time. He finished tightening the connection, tested it, then wiped his hands on his pants and picked up the phone properly. Okay, I'm back. What's up? Are you busy Friday night? Mason's schedule was never busy in the way Victoria probably meant. Define busy. Sophie have school the next day? Yeah, but her bedtime's 8. After that, I'm free. Good. I want to show you something. Can you meet me at the bank at 9? At night? I know it's weird, but trust me. Mason looked at the garbage disposal he'd just installed, then at Mrs. Chen, who was watching him with barely concealed interest from the kitchen doorway. Okay, 9 o'clock Friday. Should I bring anything? Just yourself. She hung up, and Mason stood there holding his phone while Mrs. Chen smiled knowingly. New girlfriend? She asked. It's not like that. That's what they all say. Friday night arrived cold and clear. Mason dropped Sophie at his friend Mike's house. Mike owed him about 17 babysitting favors and was happy to finally pay one back. Sophie went willingly, especially after learning Mike's wife had made cookies. Be good, Mason told her. I'm always good. Be extra good. Where are you going? To meet Victoria. Sophie's face split into a grin. Is this a date? I don't know what this is. Wear your blue shirt. I'm already wearing it. I know. That's how I knew it was a date. Mason arrived at Ridgemont Federal Bank at exactly 9 o'clock. The parking lot was empty except for Victoria's Mercedes and one light burning in the upstairs office. He tried the front door, locked. He was about to call Victoria when the door opened from inside. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, hair down instead of pulled back, and she was holding 2 bottles of beer. Come on, she said. We're going upstairs. Is this legal? I'm the regional CEO. Everything I do here is legal. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, past the conference rooms and executive offices, to a door marked Roof Access, authorized personnel only. We're going on the roof? Mason asked. Trust me. The roof was flat and empty except for HVAC units and a small section near the edge where someone had set up 2 folding chairs and a blanket. The view overlooked downtown Ridgemont. Not much to see, but the lights were pretty against the dark sky. I come up here sometimes, Victoria said, handing Mason a beer. When the office feels too small and I need to breathe, nobody else knows about it. They sat in the folding chairs, and Mason took a sip of beer that was significantly better than the stuff he usually bought. So, he said, you brought me to the roof of a bank to drink beer. I brought you to my secret spot to tell you something I haven't told anyone else. Mason turned to look at her. Victoria was staring out at the lights, fingers wrapped tight around her beer bottle. I'm quitting, she said. I gave my notice yesterday. Mason nearly dropped his beer. What? I'm done. 30 days and I'm out. Victoria, I know. It's crazy. I've spent 10 years building this career and I'm just walking away from it. My boss thinks I've lost my mind. The executive team has already started circulating rumors that I'm having a breakdown. And maybe I am, but I don't care anymore. She took a long drink of her beer and Mason waited. That day at the zoo, Victoria continued, Sophie asked why I don't just quit if my job makes me miserable. And I gave her all the usual excuses about responsibility and career trajectory and financial obligations. But the truth is, I was scared. I've been this person for so long, the successful one, the one who proved everyone wrong, that I don't know who I am without it. And now? Now I'm more scared of waking up at 40 and realizing I wasted my entire life doing something I hate, just to prove a point to people who don't even care. Victoria turned to face him, and her eyes were bright. I want to do something that matters. I want to work with animals. I want to have time for coffee dates and zoo trips and sitting on roofs drinking beer with someone I actually like. I want a life that's mine, instead of one that looks good on paper. Mason set down his beer and took Victoria's hand. That's brave. That's terrifying. Same thing, usually. Victoria laughed, shaky but real. I don't have a plan. I have some money saved, and I've been looking at marine biology graduate programs, but I'm 30 years old. I'd be starting completely over. So? So that's insane. Sophie wants to be a paleontologist this week. Last week, she wanted to be a professional mermaid. The week before that, an astronaut who studies clouds. She changes her mind constantly, and nobody thinks that's insane. She's 6, and you're 30. You've got at least 50 more years to figure out what you want to be when you grow up. Mason squeezed her hand. Besides, I know this guy who inherited $8 million and didn't change his life at all, except he's slightly less stressed about money. Change is hard, but you're already doing it. Victoria leaned her head on Mason's shoulder, and they sat like that for a while, watching the lights of Ridgemont flicker in the dark. I told myself I wouldn't do this, Victoria said quietly. Do what? Fall for someone who lives in a small town and has a normal life and makes me want things I convinced myself I didn't need. Mason's heart did something complicated. And have you? Fallen? I think I'm halfway there already. Good. Because same. Victoria lifted her head and looked at him, and Mason saw his own fear and hope reflected back. Then she kissed him, soft and tentative, like she was asking a question. Mason kissed her back, answering it. They stayed on the roof until after midnight, talking about everything and nothing. Victoria told him about the marine biology programs she'd been researching, one in California, one in North Carolina, one in Florida. Mason told her about the community fund he was setting up, the lawyer he'd hired to handle the paperwork, the list of struggling families that kept getting longer. I want to help people who are where I was 3 years ago, he said, drowning and desperate and one emergency away from complete disaster. The inheritance can't fix everything, but it can be a safety net for people who don't have one. That's beautiful, Mason. It's practical. Beauty's got nothing to do with it. You're wrong. It's both. When Mason finally left, driving home in Rex, who complained the whole way, his lips still felt warm and his chest felt lighter than it had in years. He picked up Sophie from Mike's house. She was asleep on the couch with cookie crumbs on her shirt and carried her to the truck. Did you kiss her? Sophie mumbled against his shoulder. Go back to sleep. That means yes. That means mind your business. You smell happy. That's not a thing. Is too. You smell different when you're happy. Mason buckled her into her seat and drove home through the empty streets, and he couldn't stop smiling. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of carefully managed chaos. Victoria worked her notice at the bank while secretly filling out graduate school applications. Mason finalized the legal structure for his community fund while trying not to think too hard about what Victoria leaving might mean for whatever was growing between them. They saw each other when they could, coffee before Victoria's meetings, lunch breaks stolen between Mason's jobs, late evenings after Sophie was asleep when they'd talk on the phone until one of them fell asleep mid-sentence. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Sophie, predictably, had opinions about all of it. "When is Victoria moving?" she asked one morning over breakfast. Mason looked up from his coffee. "Who said she's moving? She got into that school in Florida. I heard you talking on the phone last night. You were supposed to be asleep." "I was thirsty." Sophie took a bite of cereal with the smugness of someone who knew they'd won. "So when is she leaving?" "I don't know. She hasn't decided yet." "Are you going to be sad?" Mason considered lying, decided against it. "Yeah, baby, I'm going to be sad." "Me too. I like her." Sophie swirled her spoon through her cereal. "Can we visit her? In Florida? Maybe. If she goes." "She's going to go, Daddy. She talks about the ocean the same way you talk about fixing things. Like it makes her whole." Mason stared at his 6-year-old daughter and wondered when exactly she'd gotten so perceptive. "When did you get so smart?" "I was born smart. You just noticed." That afternoon, Mason was supposed to meet with his lawyer about the community fund paperwork. Instead, he drove to the bank. Victoria was in her office, buried under boxes and files. Her last day was Friday, 3 days away, and she looked exhausted. "Hey," Mason said from the doorway. She looked up, and her face brightened. "Hey yourself, I thought you had a meeting." "Rescheduled. Can we talk?" "Always." Mason closed the door and sat down across from her desk. The crayon drawing Sophie had made was still there, thumbtacked to the bulletin board behind Victoria's computer. "Florida accepted you," he said. Victoria's hand stilled on the file she'd been sorting. "Sophie told you?" "Walls are thin and 6-year-olds are nosy. I was going to tell you tonight." "I know." Mason leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I want you to go." Victoria blinked. "What?" "To Florida. I want you to go. This is your dream and you should chase it." "Mason." "I'm serious. You've spent 10 years doing what everyone else wanted. Now you get to do what you want. And if that's marine biology in Florida, then that's what you should do." Victoria's eyes were bright. "And us? Us is complicated. But us existing at all is kind of a miracle, so I think we can handle complicated." Mason smiled, even though it hurt. "Florida's not Mars. We can visit. Sophie's already planning it. I don't want to lose this. Whatever this is. You won't. We won't. We'll figure it out." Victoria came around the desk and kissed him, hard and desperate. "I'm falling in love with you," she said against his mouth. "That wasn't supposed to happen. I'm falling in love with you too. That definitely wasn't supposed to happen. What are we doing?" "Something stupid and brave. Apparently that's my thing now." They stood there holding each other while the bank buzzed with activity around them, and Mason tried to memorize this moment. Victoria in his arms, the future uncertain but possible, his heart full for the first time in 3 years. Victoria's last day at the bank arrived with the kind of fanfare Mason expected. The corporate office sent flowers and a plaque thanking her for her service. Her staff threw a party in the break room with store-bought cake and awkward speeches. And Victoria stood there smiling and accepting congratulations while looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. Mason and Sophie showed up at 4 o'clock, just as the party was winding down. Patricia saw them first and waved them over. "You made it," she said. "Victoria will be so happy." Victoria was indeed happy. She excused herself from a conversation with the new branch manager and made her way to them, her smile going genuine. "You came." "Wouldn't miss it," Mason said. Sophie held out a wrapped package. "We got you a present." "You didn't have to do that." "I know, but Daddy said it was important." Victoria unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a framed photograph of the 3 of them at the zoo. Mason had asked a stranger to take it by the penguin exhibit. Sophie was on Mason's shoulders. Victoria was standing next to them, and all three were laughing at something outside the frame. Mason, Victoria's voice broke. This is perfect. Sophie picked the frame. It has penguins on it, Sophie explained, because that was a good day. It was the best day. Victoria crouched down to Sophie's level. Thank you, both of you, for making these last few weeks the best part of my year. Are you still leaving on Sunday? Sophie asked. That's the plan. That's dumb. You should stay. Sophie, Mason started, but Victoria shook her head. She's not wrong. It is kind of dumb. But it's the good kind of dumb. There's a good kind? The kind where you're scared, but you do it anyway. Sophie considered this with her usual gravity. Okay, but you have to call us and send pictures and come back for my birthday. When's your birthday? March 17th. I'll be there, I promise. The party eventually wound down and people started filtering out. Mason and Sophie waited while Victoria said her final goodbyes, collected her things, and walked out of Ridgemont Federal Bank for the last time. They stood in the parking lot as the sun was setting, and nobody seemed to know what to say. So, Mason finally said, this is it. For now. Victoria looked at Sophie. Can I steal your dad for a minute? Only if you promise to give him back. I promise. They walked to the far end of the parking lot while Sophie entertained herself by jumping on and off the parking curb. When they were out of earshot, Victoria turned to face Mason. Come with me, she said. Mason stared. What? To Florida. Come with me. You and Sophie. We could make it work. Victoria, I know it's crazy. I know you have a life here and a business, and you can't just uproot everything, but I had to ask. I had to at least put it out there. Mason took her hands, held them tight. I can't. Sophie's school is here. My work is here. Her whole support system is here. And the community fund I'm setting up, people in this county need it. I can't just leave. I know. Victoria was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't bother wiping away. I just needed to ask. Ask me to wait instead. What? The program is 2 years. Ask me to wait 2 years. Ask me to visit every chance we get and FaceTime every night and make this work long distance until you finish. Then we can figure out the rest. Victoria laughed through her tears. Will you wait for me, Mason Reed? Yeah, I will. Kissed her softly. Will you come back? Eventually. Eventually, when I figure out what comes after the degree and the dream and the scary new beginning. That's good enough for me. They stood there holding each other while the sun set over Ridgemont and Sophie hummed to herself in the background. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't even really an ending at all. But it was honest and real and theirs. That Sunday, Mason and Sophie drove Victoria to the airport in Rex, who miraculously didn't make any alarming noises the entire trip. They helped her check her bags, walked her as far as security would allow, and stood there at the barrier while she got ready to leave. I'm going to miss you guys, Victoria said, crouching down to hug Sophie. We're going to miss you too. But Daddy says missing someone means you love them. Your daddy is very smart. I know. Victoria stood and turned to Mason. Take care of yourself. Take care of yourself. Learn lots of ocean stuff. I will. She kissed him once, soft and lingering. I'll call when I land. I'll answer. They watched her go through security, watched her wave one last time before disappearing into the terminal. Sophie grabbed Mason's hand. Are you sad, Daddy? Yeah, baby, but also happy, both things at once. That's confusing. Welcome to being a grown-up. They drove home in comfortable silence, and that night after Sophie was asleep, Mason's phone rang. I made it. Victoria's voice was tired but alive. My apartment is tiny and overlooks a parking lot, but the campus is beautiful and I start classes Monday and I'm terrified and excited and I miss you already. Miss you too. Tell me everything. So she did. And Mason listened, lying in his dark bedroom in Ridgemont, while Victoria described her new life in Florida, and he felt the distance between them like a physical thing. But he also felt hope. Because this wasn't an ending. It was just the hard middle part. The weeks turned into months. Victoria threw herself into her studies with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. Mason launched his community fund, officially named the Reed Family Foundation, though he'd argued against using his name and lost to his lawyer's insistence that donors liked personal stories. The first family they helped was a single mother whose car had died and who was about to lose her job because she had no way to get there. The foundation paid for repairs. She cried on the phone thanking him. Mason hung up and stared at his ceiling for 20 minutes, trying to process the fact that he could just fix people's problems now. Just make them better with money that still didn't feel real. Sophie started first grade and announced she wanted to be a marine biologist when she grew up, just like Victoria. Mason took her to the library every week to check out books about ocean life. She FaceTimed with Victoria twice a week to tell her facts about sea turtles and whale migration patterns. And every night, after Sophie was asleep, Mason and Victoria talked. Sometimes for hours, sometimes just for a few minutes before one of them fell asleep. They talked about everything: Victoria's classes and research projects, Mason's foundation work and Sophie's school adventures, the loneliness and the hope, and the slow, steady building of something neither of them quite knew how to name. It wasn't easy. Some days the distance felt impossible. Some days Mason wondered if he was being stupid, waiting for someone who might never come back. Some days Victoria called crying because she was overwhelmed and exhausted and doubting every choice she'd made. But they kept going. 3 months in, Mason got a letter forwarded from his grandfather's estate lawyer. It had been sitting in a safe deposit box, missed during the initial estate processing. The envelope was yellowed with age, addressed in his grandfather's careful handwriting. Mason opened it alone at his kitchen table, late at night with a cup of coffee gone cold. The letter was short. His grandfather had never been much for words. "Mason," it read, "if you're reading this, I'm gone and you found the money I set aside. I hope it helps. I hope it makes your life easier. But more than that, I hope it makes you brave. I spent 40 years working myself half to death because I was too scared to want anything more than survival. By the time I figured out what mattered, most of my life was behind me. Don't do what I did. Don't wait. The money's not the gift, son. Permission to live the life you want, that's the gift. Don't waste it. And tell my great-granddaughter I love her, even though I never got to meet her. Tell her to be brave, too." Mason read the letter 3 times, then called Victoria, even though it was past midnight. "Hey," she answered, voice thick with sleep. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's okay. I just needed to hear your voice." "You've got it. What's going on?" "I got a letter from my grandfather. He left it for me. About being brave and not wasting life and choosing what matters." "What does it say?" Mason read it to her, word for word, and when he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Your grandfather was right," Victoria said finally. "Permission to want things, that's everything." "Yeah, it is." "Mason? Yeah? I'm glad you're waiting for me. I'm glad you're worth waiting for." They talked until the sun came up, and when Mason finally hung up to get Sophie ready for school, he felt like something had shifted. Like his grandfather's words had given him permission he didn't know he needed. Permission to build a life that was his. Permission to love someone even when it was complicated. Permission to be brave. He made Sophie breakfast, slightly burnt pancakes because he still couldn't get the timing right, and listened to her chatter about her upcoming show-and-tell presentation. "I'm bringing Victoria the penguin," she announced. "Good choice. And I'm going to tell everyone about real Victoria and how she's studying the ocean." "That's nice, Soph. Do you think she'll come home for Christmas?" Mason had been avoiding thinking about that. Christmas was 2 months away, and Victoria's semester didn't end until mid-December. Money could buy plane tickets, but it couldn't buy back the time her program demanded. "I don't know, baby. We'll have to see. I hope she does. I miss her." "Me too." That night, after Sophie was asleep, Mason sat on his front porch with a beer and his phone. He pulled up his text thread with Victoria and typed out a message he'd been composing in his head for weeks. "I know you're busy and stressed and probably don't need one more thing on your plate, but I need you to know something. I'm not waiting because I'm hoping you'll give up and come back. I'm waiting because I believe in what you're doing and I want you to finish it. The dream doesn't work if you sacrifice it for me. So take your time. Learn everything you need to learn. Become the person you're meant to be. I'll be here when you're ready. We both will." He hit send before he could second-guess it, and 3 minutes later his phone rang. "Thank you," Victoria said, and she was crying. "Thank you for understanding." "I love you," Mason said. "Seemed like maybe I should mention that." "I love you too." so much it's stupid. Good stupid or bad stupid? The best kind of stupid. They talked until Mason's beer was warm and his porch was cold. And when they finally said goodnight, Mason went inside feeling like he'd done something right. The months kept passing. Fall turned to winter. Sophie lost her first tooth and insisted on FaceTiming Victoria to show her. The Reed Family Foundation helped its 15th family, then its 20th. Mason hired an actual administrator to help manage requests because it had gotten too big for him to handle alone. And every night, he and Victoria talked about the big things and the small things and everything in between. About the future they were building in the spaces between phone calls and the hope that someday those spaces would close. It wasn't the life Mason had imagined when he walked into that bank 6 months ago. It wasn't the life Victoria had planned when she suspended a manager for discrimination. But it was theirs, complicated and imperfect and brave. And for now, that was enough. December arrived with unexpected snow and the kind of cold that made Rex complain louder than usual. Sophie had been counting down to Christmas since Thanksgiving. Her advent calendar carefully marked with when Victoria's semester ended, December 14th, circled in red marker with stars drawn around it. 17 more days, she announced at breakfast on November 27th. I can count, Soph. I know, but I like saying it out loud. It makes it feel closer. Mason flipped a pancake that was definitely going to be burnt on one side. She might not be able to come home for Christmas. Her program is intense and plane tickets are expensive and, Daddy, you have $8 million. That's not the point. Then what is the point? Mason slid the pancake onto her plate. Burnt side down, obviously. The point is she's building something important and we support that even when it's hard. Sophie drowned her pancake in syrup with the efficiency of someone who'd perfected the ratio. I know, but I still miss her. Yeah, baby, me too. That afternoon, Mason was finishing up a job at the elementary school when Principal Morrison stopped him in the hallway. Mr. Reed, do you have a minute? Sure. What's up? I wanted to thank you personally. The Foundation's help with the Henderson family, buying them a new furnace, that was life-changing. Mrs. Henderson teaches 3rd grade here, and she was about to quit because she couldn't afford to keep her house heated and pay for daycare. You saved her job. Mason shifted his toolbox to his other hand, uncomfortable with the gratitude. I just wrote a check. That's not exactly heroic. It is to her, and to the 12 other families you've helped in the last 4 months. Principal Morrison smiled. You're doing real good here, Mason. Your grandfather would be proud. Mason drove home with those words sitting heavy in his chest. Proud. His grandfather had never said that word to him once while he was alive. But somehow, through money and letters and trust funds set up for people he'd never meet, the old man was still teaching him things. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Mason called Victoria. Hey you, she answered. I was just thinking about you. Good thoughts or bad thoughts? Mostly good. Some stressed. I have 3 finals next week and a research presentation that I'm pretty sure is going to kill me. You'll be great. You don't know that. I know you, so yeah, I do. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I miss you like physically hurts miss you. Same. Mason leaned back on his couch, phone pressed to his ear. 14 days until your semester ends. Sophie told you to count? Sophie has informed the entire household of the exact timeline. She's not subtle, is she? She's 6. Subtle isn't really in the vocabulary yet. Mason paused. I know you probably can't come home for Christmas. Your program, the expense, all of it. I just want you to know we understand. Mason, I'm serious, don't stress about it. We'll FaceTime on Christmas morning and Sophie will show you every single present in excruciating detail and it'll be fine. What if I don't want it to be fine? Victoria's voice had gone soft. What if I want to be there? Then I want you to be here, but I also want you to finish your degree and not stress yourself into a breakdown trying to do everything at once. I bought a plane ticket, Victoria said, 3 weeks ago. I was going to surprise you, but I'm terrible at keeping secrets from you. Mason sat up straight. You're coming home? December 15th through the 27th, if that's okay, if you want me there, if it's not too complicated with Sophie and the holidays and... Victoria, breathe, she breathed. We want you here. Sophie's going to lose her mind. I'm going to lose my mind. Please come home. Okay? Good. Because I already bought the ticket and it was non-refundable. They talked for another hour about logistics and plans, and how Sophie was definitely going to scream when she found out. When they finally hung up, Mason sat on his couch grinning like an idiot at nothing. He waited until morning to tell Sophie. She was eating cereal and reading a book about dolphins when Mason sat down across from her. "Hey, Soph, I have news." She looked up, suspicious. "Good news or bad news?" "Good news. Victoria's coming home for Christmas." The shriek that came out of Sophie could have shattered glass. She launched herself across the table. Cereal went flying, milk splattered everywhere, and crashed into Mason with the force of pure joy. "Really? Really, really? Really, really, December 15th. That's in 13 days. I know. We need to clean the house, and bake cookies, and make her a welcome home sign, and—" Sophie was vibrating with excitement. "Can she stay with us? Please, please, please." Mason had been thinking about that. His house had 3 bedrooms. His, Sophie's, and a spare room he'd been meaning to convert into an office but never got around to. If she wants to, but she might want to stay at a hotel where it's quiet and— "Daddy, that's dumb. She should stay here. We're basically a family anyway." "We're not," Mason started, then stopped. Because maybe they were. Maybe this weird, long-distance, complicated thing they'd built actually was family, just a different shape than he was used to. "Okay," he said. "If she wants to stay here, she can stay here." Sophie's grin could have lit up the entire house. The next 13 days were a blur of preparation that Sophie managed like a tiny military general. The house got cleaned to within an inch of its life. They baked 3 different kinds of cookies. Only 1 batch got burnt. Sophie made a welcome home sign that used an entire package of glitter and would probably be shedding sparkles until next summer. Mason tried to help, but mostly just followed Sophie's increasingly elaborate instructions while trying not to think too hard about what it meant that Victoria was coming back. Just for 2 weeks. Just for Christmas. But still. December 15th arrived cold and bright. Victoria's flight was due in at 3:45, and Sophie had been ready to leave for the airport since noon. "We're going to be early," Mason said. "Good. Early is better than late." "We're going to be 2 hours early." I said what I said. They compromised on leaving 1 hour early, which still meant they were sitting in the airport arrivals area with 45 minutes to kill. Sophie entertained herself by ranking every plane that landed on a scale of coolness. Mason entertained himself by trying not to be nervous. He failed. At exactly 3:52, Victoria emerged from the terminal pulling a suitcase and scanning the crowd. She looked tired, finals and travel and stress written across her face. But when she saw them, everything about her expression changed. Sophie launched herself forward before Mason could stop her, weaving through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never considered that adults might not see a small projectile coming at knee height. Victoria dropped her suitcase and caught Sophie mid-jump, spinning her around while Sophie laughed and clung on like a barnacle. "You're here! You're actually here!" "I'm actually here." Victoria set Sophie down but kept holding her hand, and when she looked up at Mason, her eyes were bright. "Hi." "Hi yourself." Mason closed the distance between them and kissed her right there in the airport arrivals area, in front of everyone, because he'd waited 4 months and he was done waiting. When they broke apart, Sophie was grinning up at both of them with enormous satisfaction. "Told you," she said. "Told us what?" Victoria asked. "That you guys were going to be gross and hold hands and stuff." The drive home was filled with Sophie's nonstop chatter about everything Victoria had missed. The school play where she played a tree, the time Mason accidentally locked himself out of the house and had to climb through a window, the new family the foundation had helped whose daughter was Sophie's age, and now they were best friends. Victoria listened to all of it with the attention of someone who genuinely cared, asking questions and laughing in all the right places. And Mason drove his terrible truck through the familiar streets of Ridgemont, thinking that maybe home wasn't a place. Maybe it was this, the people you chose and who chose you back. They pulled into the driveway just as the sun was setting. Victoria climbed out and stood there looking at Mason's house, small and ordinary and nothing special, like it was something precious. "It's perfect," she said. "It's a mess," Mason countered. "The roof leaks when it rains hard and the water pressure is terrible and—" "It's perfect," Victoria repeated, "because you're here." Sophie grabbed Victoria's suitcase with both hands and started dragging it toward the door. "Come on, I need to show you my room and the cookies we made." And the sign I made with 700 pieces of glitter. 700 exactly? Victoria asked. Approximately 700. I didn't count. The house was exactly as chaotic as Mason had feared. Sophie gave Victoria the full tour, approximately 30 minutes for a 1,000-square-foot house, because Sophie felt the need to explain the backstory of every single object. The kitchen where Daddy burns things. The bathroom where they keep the good soap that smells like flowers. Sophie's room where Victoria the penguin lived with his friends. Mason made coffee while listening to Sophie's tour guide narration drift through the house, and he felt something settle in his chest. This was right. Victoria being here, Sophie happy, the three of them existing in the same space instead of separated by 1,000 miles. That night, after Sophie was finally asleep, hyped up on excitement and cookies, Mason and Victoria sat on the couch with mugs of tea neither of them was drinking. "So," Victoria said, "this is your life." "This is my life. Small house, loud kid, early mornings. It's not glamorous." "I don't want glamorous. I had glamorous. It was empty." She turned to face him. "This is real. This is what matters." Mason took her hand, threaded their fingers together. "How's school? Really?" "Hard. Amazing. Terrifying. I'm the oldest person in most of my classes by about 5 years, and sometimes I feel like an imposter. But then I'm in the lab working with actual marine specimens, or I'm out on the research boat collecting data, and I remember why I'm doing this." "You look happy." "I am happy. Stressed and exhausted and perpetually behind on sleep, but happy." Victoria leaned her head on his shoulder. "I missed this, though. Missed you. Missed Sophie. Missed having people who care about me as a person instead of as a student or a colleague." "We definitely care about you." "I know. That's the terrifying part." "Why terrifying?" "Because I have one more year of school, one more year of being 1,000 miles away, and I don't know what happens after. The research opportunities are in California, North Carolina, Hawaii, places that aren't here." Mason had been avoiding thinking about that. The after. The what comes next. "We'll figure it out." "Will we?" "Yeah, we will. Maybe it's messy. Maybe it's complicated. Maybe we're doing this backwards and wrong and nothing like other people do it. But we'll figure it out." Victoria lifted her head and kissed him, slow and thorough. "I love you, Mason Reed." "Love you too, Victoria Hayes." They stayed up too late talking about everything and nothing, and when Victoria finally went to bed in the spare room that Sophie had insisted they prepare like a hotel, Mason lay awake thinking about futures and possibilities and how sometimes the best things were the ones you never planned for. Christmas approached with the kind of chaos Mason had learned to expect. Sophie insisted on making elaborate decorations, most of which involved glitter and construction paper and engineering that defied physics. Victoria joined in with enthusiasm, and Mason came home from work one day to find his living room transformed into what Sophie called a winter wonderland and what Mason called a craft store explosion. "It's festive," Victoria said. "It's going to take months to clean up. That's the spirit." They fell into an easy rhythm, Mason working his regular jobs, Victoria studying for her spring semester at the kitchen table while Sophie did homework next to her, the three of them cooking dinner together in a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people, let alone 3. It felt like family. On December 23rd, Mason took Victoria to see the foundation office. It was small, just 2 rooms above the hardware store downtown, but it was real. Sarah Martinez, the administrator he'd hired, was there, organizing files for the holiday break. "Mason, and you must be Victoria. I've heard so much about you." Sarah shook Victoria's hand with genuine warmth. "Mason talks about you constantly." "He does not," Mason protested. "He absolutely does. Victoria says this, and Victoria thinks that, and I should ask Victoria's opinion." "You're basically our unofficial consultant." Victoria laughed. "I don't know anything about running a foundation." "You know about people. That's more important." Sarah pulled out a folder. "We've helped 32 families so far. Emergency car repairs, medical bills, rent assistance, utility payments, small amounts that make enormous differences." Mason watched Victoria flip through the files, each one a story of someone who'd been drowning and now had space to breathe. A single dad whose transmission died right before Christmas. A grandmother raising 3 grandkids who couldn't afford to fix her furnace. A young couple whose baby needed medicine they couldn't pay for. This is incredible, Victoria said quietly. Mason, this is really incredible. It's just money. It's not just money. It's hope. It's someone caring enough to help. It's proof that people aren't alone. She looked up at him with something like awe. Your grandfather gave you money, but you turned it into meaning. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Mason and Victoria sat on his front porch wrapped in blankets against the cold. The street was quiet, Christmas lights twinkling from neighbors' houses. I've been thinking, Victoria said. That sounds dangerous. I'm serious. She turned to face him. After I finish my degree, I want to come back here. Mason's heart stopped. What? Not permanently, not right away, but eventually. I want to do my research, build my career, establish myself in the field, but then I want to come back, because this is where you are. This is where Sophie is. This is where I want to build a life. Victoria, you can't give up research opportunities for... I'm not giving up anything. I'm choosing what matters. She took his hands. I spent 30 years living the life other people wanted for me. Then I spent 4 months building the life I wanted for myself. And now I know what I actually want. A career I love, people I love, a place that feels like home. I can have all of that. It just looks different than I expected. You're sure? I'm terrified, but yeah, I'm sure. Mason pulled her close and kissed her while the Christmas lights blinked around them and the cold air made their breath fog. Okay, he said. We'll make it work. We'll make it work, Victoria agreed. Christmas morning arrived with Sophie jumping on Mason's bed at 6:15. It's Christmas! Wake up! Santa came! There are presents! Come on, come on, come on! Mason groaned and checked his phone. 6:15 in the morning should be illegal. Soph, give me 10 minutes. No time. Victoria's already up. She's making coffee. We have to open presents. They stumbled downstairs to find Victoria in the kitchen, looking far too awake for the ungodly hour. She'd made coffee and hot chocolate and somehow found time to arrange cookies on a plate. Merry Christmas, she said. You're a morning person, Mason accused. How did I not know you're a morning person? I've been awake since 5 doing research. This is just science. Sophie was already at the tree, vibrating with barely contained excitement. They'd agreed on a simple Christmas, a few thoughtful gifts, nothing excessive. But Sophie had apparently missed that memo and had made presents for both of them. For Mason, a framed drawing of the 3 of them in front of their house. For Victoria, a detailed picture of the ocean with dolphins and fish and what might have been a mermaid. I researched marine life, Sophie explained seriously, so it would be accurate. It's beautiful, Victoria said, and she wasn't lying. I'm going to hang this in my apartment in Florida. Really? Really? They opened the rest of the presents. Books for Sophie, a new toolkit for Mason because Victoria had noticed his was falling apart. A beautiful necklace for Victoria with a small silver dolphin pendant that made her eyes go bright. Mason, this is too much. It's not even close to too much. They spent the rest of the morning in pajamas, eating cookies for breakfast and watching Sophie play with her new toys. It was simple and ordinary and exactly perfect. That afternoon, Mason's phone rang. A state lawyer, on Christmas Day. That couldn't be good. Mason Reed, he answered, stepping into the kitchen for privacy. Mr. Reed, I apologize for calling on the holiday, but something came up that I thought you'd want to know about immediately. What is it? We found another letter from your grandfather. It was in a separate safe deposit box at a different bank. The box was set to automatically open on Christmas Day this year, 5 years after his death. Mason's hand tightened on the phone. What does it say? I'm sending you a scan right now, but Mr. Reed, you should read it with your family. The email came through 30 seconds later. Mason opened it with shaking hands, and Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway. Everything okay? I don't know yet. He opened the attachment, and his grandfather's handwriting filled the screen. Mason, it read, if you're reading this on Christmas Day, it means 5 years have passed since I died. It means you've had time to process the inheritance, set up Sophie's trust, maybe even started using the money the way I hoped you would. I'm writing this letter to tell you one more secret. There's a property I never mention, a house on the coast in North Carolina. I bought it 40 years ago when I was young and stupid and in love with a woman who worked at a marine research station. We were going to get married and live there together. But she died before we could. I never sold it. Never could bring myself to. I kept it all these years thinking maybe someday I'd retire there, but I never did. It's yours now. Do something with it I couldn't. Build a life there. Be happy. Don't make the mistakes I made. And if you found someone to love, hold on to them. Life's too short for regret. The deed and property information are with the lawyer. Merry Christmas, son. Mason read the letter twice, then looked up at Victoria, who was standing there with tears streaming down her face. He left you a house, she whispered, on the coast, in North Carolina, where you want to do research, where there are multiple marine research stations. They stared at each other while Sophie called from the living room asking what was taking so long. We should check it out, Mason said. The property, see what condition it's in. When? After New Year's, before you go back to school? Okay, yes, let's do that. They told Sophie about the house over dinner. She declared it an adventure and immediately started planning what kind of fish they might see. That night, after Sophie was finally asleep, Mason and Victoria looked up the property online. It was perfect. A small house right on the coast, weathered but solid, with windows that faced the ocean and enough space for a family. It needed work. The listing photos showed dated interiors and a sagging porch, but the bones were good. We could fix it up, Mason said. I know construction, and you could be near research facilities, and Sophie would have the ocean, and Mason. Victoria turned to face him. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying maybe we don't have to choose between your career and being together. Maybe my grandfather gave us a way to have both. You'd move? Leave Ridgemont? For you? For this? Yeah, I would. Mason took her hands. The foundation can operate from anywhere. Sarah's doing most of the day-to-day work anyway. Sophie's young enough that changing schools won't destroy her. And I can do plumbing work anywhere. But what I can't do is spend another year only seeing you on FaceTime. Victoria kissed him hard. Are we really doing this? I think we are. They flew to North Carolina 2 days after New Year's, the three of them piling onto a plane for what Sophie declared was the best adventure ever. The house was exactly as the photos had shown, small and weathered and beautiful. It sat on a bluff overlooking the ocean, close enough to hear the waves but high enough to be safe from flooding. Mason walked through the rooms mentally cataloging repairs. New roof, updated electrical, refinished floors. Nothing he couldn't handle. Victoria stood at the window looking out at the ocean with an expression Mason had never seen before. Pure peace. And Sophie ran from room to room, declaring which one would be hers, and where they could put a reading nook, and could they please get a dog now that they'd have a yard. What do you think? Mason asked Victoria. I think your grandfather was a romantic. I think he was giving us permission. To what? To build something new. To not make his mistakes. To choose love over fear. Victoria turned from the window and wrapped her arms around him. Then let's choose it. They made an offer on the property that afternoon. It was accepted 2 days later. The next 6 months were chaos. Mason put his house in Ridgemont on the market. It sold in 3 weeks to a young couple expecting their first baby. He hired a moving company and started the slow process of packing up a life. Sophie finished first grade and said goodbye to her friends with promises to FaceTime every week. The foundation transitioned to fully remote operations with Sarah managing everything from Ridgemont. Victoria finished her first year of graduate school with honors and spent the summer doing field research while Mason renovated the North Carolina house. They talked every night, making plans for the future they were building together. In August, Mason and Sophie moved into the coastal house. It still wasn't perfect. Mason was still working on the kitchen, and the master bathroom needed a complete overhaul, but it was theirs. Sophie started second grade at a school 3 miles away. She made friends immediately and declared the ocean was better than she'd imagined. And in September, Victoria moved in. Not part-time, not visiting, moved in. She'd transferred to a marine biology program at the university 30 minutes away. Her research focused on coastal conservation, and she spent her days doing work she loved with people who respected her. They built a life that was messy and imperfect and completely theirs. Mason started a new foundation branch in North Carolina. Victoria took Sophie on ocean research trips. They fought about whose turn it was to do dishes and how to discipline a strong-willed 7-year-old and whether they needed to replace the porch or if it could wait another year. They were family, 1 year after moving to North Carolina, on a cold October morning that reminded Mason of the day he'd walked into Ridgemont Federal Bank, he woke up to find Victoria already awake, watching him. "Morning," he said. "I want to marry you," Victoria said. Mason blinked. "What?" "I want to marry you. I want to officially be Sophie's stepmother. I want this life we're building to be permanent. So I'm asking, will you marry me?" "Shouldn't I be asking you?" "Why? I'm the one who decided. I'm just letting you know." Mason laughed and pulled her close. "Yeah, yes, absolutely yes." They got married on the beach in front of the house 6 months later. Small ceremony, just close friends and Sophie, who served as the world's most opinionated flower girl. Sarah came from Ridgemont. Mike and his family made the trip. Even Patricia from the bank showed up with a gift, and memories of the day, everything changed. Sophie stood between them during the ceremony, holding both their hands, and when the officiant asked if anyone objected, she loudly announced, "If anyone objects, I'm going to fight them," which got a laugh from everyone assembled. Mason looked at Victoria in her simple white dress, at Sophie in her fancy outfit already getting sandy, at the life they'd somehow built from inheritance and hope and choosing each other every day. His grandfather had given him money, but what Mason had learned was that money was just permission to dream bigger, risk more, choose love over fear. The real inheritance wasn't the millions in the bank. It was the courage to build a life worth living. That evening, after the wedding guests had left and Sophie was finally asleep, Mason and Victoria sat on their porch watching the ocean. "No regrets?" Mason asked. "Not a single one," Victoria said. "You? Just that I didn't ask you to marry me first. You can ask me to renew our vows in 50 years. That'll be your chance." "Deal." They sat in comfortable silence while the waves crashed and the stars came out. Mason thought about the widowed father who'd walked into a bank wearing dirty work boots, the lonely CEO who'd been performing success while dying inside, the 6-year-old girl who'd lost her mother but gained a family. They'd all been broken in different ways. The money hadn't fixed that brokenness, but it had given them space to heal, time to find each other, permission to build something new. And that, Mason figured, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.